Stop the ceremony! Laughter. Mocking eyes. A groom's voice, loud enough for the world to hear. Why marry someone with nothing? His arm clung to another woman, her smirk sharp as a blade. Gasps echoed through the hall as hundreds turned to watch. She stood frozen, dressed in silence, her dignity stripped in front of them all. Not one hand reached to help. Not one voice rose to defend. But what none of them knew was that the bride they mocked carried a legacy worth more than their empire. This is the story of a wedding that ended a fortune. Comment your city below. Amara had always lived her life with quiet dignity. Born into a modest neighborhood, she grew up knowing that the world rarely treated women like her, black, soft-spoken, and determined, with the same kindness it offered others. Yet, despite the subtle sneers from neighbors or the condescending remarks from her teachers, she carried herself with grace. She excelled in her studies, not because she sought applause, but because she believed her late father's words. Power isn't always loud. Amara, sometimes it's the strength to endure. Now, years later, her life seemed far from those narrow streets of her childhood. She had stepped into a world most people only dreamed of. A world of towering glass buildings, black-tie dinners, and invitations embossed in gold. She was about to marry into one of the wealthiest families in the country, a family whose name was whispered with awe in business circles. To the outside world, it looked like a perfect story, the hard-working young woman who had captured the heart of a powerful man. But behind the smiles and carefully posed photographs, Amara felt the unease that few could see. His family, from the very first introduction, had looked at her with thinly veiled disdain. They complimented her with words that stung, praising her grace for someone with her background, or remarking on her accent as though it were a flaw. At dinner tables, conversations would fall silent when she spoke, only to resume with laughter the moment she stopped. She never reacted. Her silence, though painful, was her shield. For Amara, the upcoming wedding was not just about love. It was about stepping into a world where she would always be watched, judged, and underestimated. Still, she believed love could bridge the gaps that wealth, prejudice, and arrogance created. She told herself that the man she loved would protect her from their scorn, that his vows would stand stronger than their whispers. On the morning of her wedding, sunlight streamed through the high windows of her bridal suite, bouncing off ivory silk and crystal vases. Everything sparkled as though the universe itself had prepared for her day. She stood before the mirror in her gown, not lavish or dripping with diamonds, but elegant in its simplicity, a dress chosen to reflect her, not the wealth she was marrying into. She wanted to walk down that aisle as herself, not as the woman they expected her to pretend to be. Yet as she fastened the final clasp, a quiet dread lingered in her chest. Something told her this day would not go as planned. The unease in her stomach was not nerves. It was the echo of every insult, every glance, every smirk she had endured in silence. She took one final look at her reflection, inhaled deeply, and whispered to herself, "Endure?" She had no idea that within hours, her silence would break, and the truth would shatter everything they thought they knew about her. The grand hall shimmered with crystal chandeliers, every corner polished to perfection. Guests poured in, dressed in gowns that glittered and suits that whispered of old money. To them, this was not just a wedding, it was a spectacle, a display of power and prestige. Every eye searched for flaws, ready to dissect every detail. And in the center of it all stood Amara, her presence radiating quiet grace. But as she walked past the rows of tables, the whispers began. Some stifled laughter, others leaned closer to murmur behind jeweled hands. They eyed her dress, too simple compared to the sparkling gowns of women bred for this circle. They mocked her accent when she greeted elders with warmth. They saw not a bride to be celebrated, but an outsider who had wandered into their world. At the family's table, the groom's mother tightened her lips in disapproval. His sisters exchanged glances that dripped with contempt. Every insult was subtle, but it cut like glass. One guest remarked loudly enough for others to hear, "It's admirable, really. Marrying someone with so little to bring. Another scoffed. She carries herself well, considering where she comes from. Amara remained silent, as always. Her silence was her survival. But inside, her chest tightened with each word, each reminder that she was never meant to belong. Then came the first crack in the facade. The groom, her soon-to-be husband, walked into the hall with a grin far too wide, his arm linked not with hers, but with another woman's. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Amara felt her stomach twist as she recognized her. Vanessa, the woman whispered about at late-night parties. The one rumored to have a closer relationship with him than any fiancé should tolerate. Vanessa's dress was loud, dripping in sequins that caught every flash of light. Her smirk was sharper than a blade, her eyes locked on Amara with deliberate malice. As they approached the altar, the groom barely looked at Amara. Instead, he basked in the laughter of his friends, flaunting Vanessa's presence like a prize. The humiliation spread like wildfire. Guests chuckled behind their champagne glasses. His family did nothing to hide their satisfaction. To them, this was proof. Amara was not worthy, not equal, not one of them. Still, Amara stood tall. Her silence was the only dignity she had left, though every insult gnawed at her resolve. She had come prepared to face prejudice, but not betrayal from the man who once promised her protection. The ceremony began, yet tension clung to the air like smoke. At the moment of vows, the groom paused, glanced at Vanessa, and laughed. "I can't do this," he announced boldly, his voice echoing through the hall. "Why marry someone who has nothing, when I already have everything right here?" His arm tightened around Vanessa as the guests erupted in cruel laughter. Amara's breath caught in her throat. She had been stripped bare, humiliated in front of hundreds. And still she did not cry. Her silence deepened, and her gaze fixed on the ground, unshaken. But the cruelty did not end there. Vanessa stepped forward, bold and smug. "This dress," she sneered, eyeing Amara's simple gown, "looks like something borrowed, something second-hand. Maybe that's all she's ever known." The guests roared with approval, feeding on the humiliation like vultures circling prey. The weight of it pressed down on Amara's shoulders, threatening to break her. Yet deep within, something stirred. Her silence was no longer just a shield, it was gathering into a storm, and then the twist of fate began to unravel. A murmur rose from the back of the hall as two sharply dressed men approached the groom's table. They were not guests. They were investigators carrying files thick with evidence. They asked for Vanessa by name, their tone cold, unyielding. Whispers spread like fire. Some stood to see better. Others gasped in disbelief. Vanessa's smirk faltered for the first time. One investigator opened a folder laying out documents that revealed a trail of fraud, theft, and embezzlement. The name tied to every stolen cent? Vanessa. And not from strangers, but from the estate of Amara's late father. The room shifted. Laughter turned to stunned silence. The same people who mocked Amara now stared at her in disbelief. She, the woman they ridiculed, was suddenly at the center of a revelation that threatened to upend everything. The groom stammered, his face drained of color. Vanessa tried to laugh it off, but the investigators stepped closer, their words firm, undeniable. She had stolen from the very legacy she mocked Amara for not having. Amara lifted her gaze at last. Her silence was no longer weakness. It was waiting. And now, as the truth began to surface, the storm she had held back was ready to break. The hall was frozen in anticipation. What would happen next would not only define Amara's future, but destroy the illusion her enemies had built around her. The hall erupted in chaos. Gasps, shouts, and hurried whispers filled the air as the investigators laid out document after document, each page heavy with undeniable proof. Vanessa, once smug and untouchable, was suddenly trembling, her painted smile cracking into desperation. She tried to protest, but every word only tightened the noose around her. The groom, pale and furious, demanded answers. "What is this? Some kind of mistake?" But the investigators' voices were calm, steady, unforgiving. There was no mistake. The woman he paraded proudly had stolen millions, and not from faceless corporations, but from the estate of Amara's late father. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Those who mocked Amara only hours ago now turned to stare at her, realization dawning. She was no ordinary woman. She was the daughter of a man whose legacy stretched far deeper than their shallow judgments. The fortune Vanessa stole was not just money. It was a heritage, a legacy carved with sacrifice, now resting in Amara's hands. Amara stood still, her silence sharper than any scream. For years she had endured whispers, ridicule, and prejudice. Today every insult was laid bare as hollow. They called her nobody. But in this moment, the truth roared louder than their laughter. She was the rightful heir, the woman with everything they believed she lacked. The groom's mother sank into her chair, her smugness dissolving into fear. His sisters averted their eyes, shame burning on their faces. The guests who once laughed at Amara now whispered her name with awe, as though afraid to speak too loudly in the presence of someone so much greater than they had realized. And then the groom made his final mistake. He turned on Amara, his voice dripping with venom. "This doesn't change what you are. Money doesn't buy you class. You'll never belong here." His words echoed through the hall, cruel and desperate. But this time, Amara did not stay silent. She lifted her head, her eyes steady, her voice calm yet commanding. "I don't need to belong to your world," she said, "because it was never mine to begin with." The room froze. Her words hung heavy in the air, carrying the weight of every insult, every sneer, every wound inflicted by prejudice. In one sentence, she reclaimed not only her dignity but her power, and as Vanessa was dragged out in disgrace, the billion-dollar truth of Amara's inheritance revealed. One decision remained, the deal that bound these families together. All eyes turned to her. Would she let the marriage, the fortune, the legacy continue? Or would she end it all with a single word? The world held its breath. Dear audience, where are you watching from? Drop your city name in the comments. The silence that followed was heavier than any insult Amara had ever endured. The groom stood at the altar, exposed, humiliated, clinging to a world that no longer held him. His mistress was dragged away in disgrace, the mask of superiority ripped from her face. And Amara, once mocked as nothing, now stood as the rightful heir to a billion-dollar legacy. She looked out at the crowd, the same people who had whispered, judged, and laughed. Their eyes no longer carried contempt. Now they carried fear, respect, and perhaps even guilt. For years they had measured her worth by her skin, her voice, her background. But the truth had turned their prejudice into ashes. With a calm resolve, Amara turned to the officials and ended the $950 million deal binding the two families. The contract that was meant to strengthen his family's empire dissolved with a single stroke. She walked away from the altar, not abandoned, not broken, but free. Free from their scorn, free from the cage of their expectations, free to carry her father's legacy on her own terms. Her silence had been her shield. But her decision became her sword. For Amara, the victory was not in wealth or inheritance. It was in proving that dignity, resilience, and truth could outlast the loudest voices of prejudice. The scars of humiliation would remain, but so would the strength forged in the fire of injustice. And this is where the story reaches beyond her. Because Amara's silence, her endurance, her triumph, it isn't just hers. It mirrors the experience of countless black women and men across the world who are underestimated, disrespected, and dehumanized. Who are told they have nothing, when in reality, they carry legacies far richer than their oppressors can imagine. This story is not only about one bride at one wedding. It's about a system that laughs at silence, mocks difference, and underestimates resilience. It's about every moment where prejudice is dressed as tradition, where cruelty hides behind wealth, where racism is excused as just the way things are. But every silence has its breaking point, and when it breaks, the world shifts. So the question remains, how many more Amaras will the world try to silence before it finally learns? Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that reveal truths too often ignored.